I don't think I usually use it.
I've used it.
I hear more people saying it than I use it. Usually I'm like, well, what's
I'm
that
guilty
like?
of using it. I've used it a lot. Quite a bit.
I probably do use it a lot, but now I'm like,
Maybe I should restrain from using it.
I use it with the non-police.
Yo, whoa, hey, that's misguided. No, remember, Matthew 5:14.
Your energy wasn't aligned correctly. Everything happens for a reason. Energy, I mean,
You know. Because you're pushing them away. Because then you're giving them places of the world to drown them. Yeah, but see, that's a Buddhist, not a Buddhist.
Hinduism. Telling me, he was like, man, it's like, people should get like bad karma because they do it. But I never see them. I see them actually like, when you do better, and it's like, why is karma a thing? Like, why are we?
Yeah. But that is a Hinduism. I mean, I love that song from Radio. Was it Comic?
Okay, 30 more seconds.
And so God forgives. And I've seen it too. It's like people that do bad and they continue to do themselves. But deep inside, do you think they sleep well? I mean, they know they can.
It's not for me to know.
I wouldn't.
All right, let's go over it together. Has anybody ever said to you, everything happens for a reason? Most of us have heard this statement from someone at this point, or most of us have said it at someone else. Okay? The statement is true if we mean that we live in a world of cause and effect. Right? Literally everything happens for a reason. Okay? Actions create consequences. Our own choices produce result. For example, if you run the red light, what happens? Ticket or a car crash. Okay, there was an action and there's consequence. Some kind of consequence. Okay? Okay, so there's a reason for everything. If you mean in that sense, okay? But most people don't really mean that. All right, let's go next.
Okay, usually, however, when we say this phrase, we're not talking about cause and effect. Most often, we are speaking in response to suffering. When something bad has happened and we are trying to help someone through a difficult time, we say, it was meant to be. When someone dies, we hear it. And we hear, it must have been their time, or it must have been God's will.
Okay, so something bad happens in their life. Oh yeah, there's a reason. Okay, like this is God's will. God wanted this to happen, so he wanted suffering to happen so that something good can come out of this situation. So there's a reason. There must have been a reason for this. Okay, we use these kind of things. Let's keep going.
We may assume that while we don't yet understand why it had to happen, all events in our lives unfold according to God's predetermined plan. Since God is in charge of everything, whatever happens, a personal setback, an untimely death, a natural disaster, reflects the will and purposes of God.
Okay, let's keep going.
If we examine the notion that everything happens for a reason, the first problem is that it eliminates the concept of personal responsibility for our actions. If everything happens according to God's immutable plan, then whatever I do must have been God's will. If I drink and drive and someone is killed as a result, it must have been the victim's time. Yes, I did a terrible thing, but God used me to accomplish some greater purpose. I cannot be held responsible for my actions. I was only doing what God willed me to do.
So, okay, we're going over some of the, again, these are not biblical reasoning, and these are actually not very good reasoning, okay? But I'm going to just go over some of the philosophical reasoning of why this could be ridiculous. Everything has a reason, right? So one of the reasons you go, okay, so this was God's will. So even if I make a mistake, it was God's will, right? Everything has a reason, right? God's reason. So therefore, again, you guys already laughed at it because it sounds stupid, okay? Let's keep going. Let's see the second problem.
A second problem with the notion that everything happens for a reason is that it makes God responsible for everyone's actions. If God actually intended for everything to happen, then God is responsible for every terrible thing that happens in our world. It would mean that tragedies do not happen in spite of God's will, but because of it.
Does that make sense? So then who's responsible for all the negative thing that happened in our lives? God. Who's responsible for 40,000 people dying in Turkey? God as well. Let's keep going.
If this way of thinking is true, then every rape, every murder, every act of child abuse, every war, every terrible storm or earthquake that claims people's lives, every child that died of starvation, all these are part of God's plans. That is the awful truth that we must confront when we mind to the ways that everything happens.
Right. So, but people don't think about that. Right? People just think, oh, I just want to make myself feel better or make other people feel better. Just go, oh yeah, there's a reason for this. But they don't actually think about the implication of what they're actually saying then. Okay, let's keep going.
The third problem with the notion that everything happens for a reason and that whatever happens is part of God's plan is that it leads to fatalism and indifference. A fatalist thinks whatever is going to happen will happen. Whatever will be, will be. We are powerless to change.
Right. If God's will does everything, if God controls all of our lives, then what's the point of doing good? What's the point of doing bad? It's just like whatever. Nothing matters anyways. God controls everything anyways. Okay. Let's keep going.
If you're a committed fatalist, there's no reason ever to wear a seatbelt. If you're meant to die in a car accident, you will. If you're not meant to die, you won't. If you take a fatalistic view, why work out, eat healthy foods, or take care of your body? After all, when it's your time, it's your time.
Very good. Okay. So this kind of thought is what we call determinism. Okay. Or some of you guys, I'm sure, have heard the word predestination before. If you have, then again, this determinism is like the big idea, and the predestination is inside that big idea. So the basic idea is that God controls everything that we do. And of course, you guys are like, no. Like, I woke up this morning and I chose to come to church. Okay? But that's all just in your mind. You're just doing everything that God has already pre-planned in your mind already. Okay? Let's go a little bit more into determinism. By the way, I'm going over this kind of quickly so that we can go over a lot more questions. Okay? And then, if you guys do have more questions, I could go more in depth as well. Let's keep going.
John Calvin was a brilliant lawyer, theologian, and pastor. He was one of the most important figures in the Protestant Reformation. One of the defining emphases of Calvin's theology involved his understanding of God's sovereignty. Calvin seemed to believe that for God to be sovereign, that is, to be the highest authority and to have dominion over the universe, then God must create everything that happens. If something happens that is not God's will, Calvin argued, then God does not, in fact, have dominion over everything. This view is sometimes referred to as theological determinism.
There's a lot of different terms for this. So determinism is one. People don't use it as much, but you're going to hear some people say Calvinism. Why? Because, again, John Calvin. And then nowadays you're going to hear a lot more people using Reformed theology. So if you hear anything like Reformed, this is what they're talking about here. Okay, just letting you know, most of the content you are probably consuming, like Christian content, they're probably Reformed. Okay, like my favorite pastors are all Reformed. Okay, so this is not just like some crazy people who believe in this stuff. A lot of the songs that were written are by Reformed people as well. So if you actually read some of the lyrics very carefully, you're just like, oh, that's what they mean. Okay, and also just letting you know, a lot of you guys, when you guys talk about God or talk about something, a lot of you guys speak things that are also Reformed as well. Okay, you just don't, again, you're not like thinking through all of the implications of it. Okay, so again, this is a lot more, I know, like, again, going over like some of the problems, you're like, no way, like I don't believe this. Like there's no way I would believe this, and yet you're consumed by it a lot more than you think. And you say these kind of things that are actually coming from determinism a lot more than you think. I'm just letting you guys know. Okay, this is not a criticism, but that's the reality. Okay, so I want you guys to be aware of that. It's around us a lot more than we think. And some of you guys, even though on the outside you're like, no, I don't believe this, but on the inside you really believe this. And this has definitely messed up your theology a lot. Okay, let's keep going. According to this view, even our thoughts and feelings are governed by God. You might think that you had an original plan, but in Calvin's reality, God placed that idea in your mind. Okay? You didn't decide to take that job offer or even take out the garbage. God, guiding your thoughts, decided those things for you. Thus, for Calvin, everything happens for a reason. for good or for bad, fixed by God's decree. So again, there's two different. When you say the word God, there's a reason for everything. Again, most of the people when they say that, what they're thinking is, yeah, God. God is the reason for everything. So you got this job and you didn't get this job. There's a reason for everything. That means, yeah, that was God's plan. Okay. Oh, you married this girl or this guy. God's plan. God's will. Does that make sense? Let's keep going.
Another particular focus of theology determinism is called predestination. That means that God has predetermined everything that happens, that life unfolds according to script. God has written before any of us are born. But one of the implications of this belief is that God has predetermined before. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're right. Before we are born.
Before we are born, whether we accept His salvation or be among the damned, that means we have no choice about whether or not we will accept the grace of God.
Yeah, so the basic idea is that from the get-go, God has already determined, and that's why it's called predetermination, okay? Predestination, I mean. That means all of us in here are Christians, right? So therefore, we have been already chosen by God. Those people who will never accept Christianity, it's not because they have chosen, but God already predetermined or predestined them already to hell. Okay? So again, these are all the implications of determinism. But again, we don't think about this in depth. Okay? So I know, again, most of you guys would disagree with this, but you guys would disagree with it not because you have a biblical reason, because in the Bible, there's a lot of Bible verses that support this. Okay? But let me finish, and then you could ask. But most of you guys don't believe in, you guys are like, don't like this because philosophically, it doesn't make you feel good. And that's why a lot of determinists say to free will people, read the Bible. Okay? Just because you don't feel good, that doesn't mean that this can't be true. Okay, did you have a question?
Yeah, so when we use language like, well, God knew in advance what He was going to choose.
Okay.
What she was going to choose.
Okay.
Like whether salvation.
Sure.
Is that the same thing as God has predetermined whether we will accept His?
Sure. Good. That's a great question. Okay. So, try to stay with me. I don't want to lose you guys. So that can be determinism. So determinists would use those verses as, like, for example, like we know that God predetermines certain things. Okay. So for example, did He choose certain people? Absolutely. Okay. So the Bible uses those language. Like for example, did Jesus know that who was going to betray Him? Okay, so He had foreknowledge before. Okay, so determinists would use that and say, oh, you see, Jesus knew because Jesus is the one who chose Him. Okay, but free will, just because God knows something, that doesn't mean that you don't have free will. Yeah, there is another view. Yeah. So basically, for example, Abel, I know that you're going to sleep tonight. Just because I have foreknowledge, that doesn't mean I caused him to sleep. Does that make sense? So foreknowledge doesn't necessarily mean that I made that happen. Yeah. But how they would see it is, yes, because God foretold it, it's only because God already decided it. Yeah.
So there's a verse in the Bible that talks about predestined.
Sure.
Predestined.
Yes.
So that verse in the Bible, I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of controversy.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Romans chapter 8.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it means that God predestined like the people to be able to choose salvation.
Sure.
And to have that choice.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean He predestined everybody from the beginning of
Yeah,
the world.
right.
So this person's not gonna be saved.
Right.
It doesn't mean that.
Exactly. So I want you guys to know that these are not like non-Christian versus Christians or like very small sect of Christians who believe this and then everybody believes in free will. What I'm trying to tell you guys is actually the opposite. Okay? There's actually I think like a pretty good amount of people who actually believe in this. Christians. Okay? But most of you guys have heard this phrase, free will, free will, free will, a lot because you grew up Adventist. But outside of the Adventist world, like this is pretty big.
What's a pastor that's a good example of?
Tim Keller,
Is he?
Francis Chan.
Really?
Oh yeah. Every big name, I will probably, if you ask me, they're probably determinists.
Because I listened to so many of his sermons and I don't know.
Oh, that was. I'll send you a sermon
Okay.
where he
I
talks
must
about.
have not. I must have not.
And that
You don't know.
and that's all. That's also the thing is that a lot of these determinists they use like these languages of choices and free will, but they don't. They mean it a little bit different than we do. Yeah. Yeah. My favorite pastors are all determinists.
So no, going back to what you had mentioned about our will and God's will.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
like that one person that was gonna get behind the wheel and drink.
Sure.
I mean, where does that stand?
Yeah. So again, that was God's will. God wanted that to happen because He had a grand plan that something good will come out of it. We just don't understand it. But that's the great. There's always, like even Jesus dying on the cross, for the disciples and everybody else during that time, nobody foresaw how that could be good.
So is it right to say it was meant to happen?
Okay, so that's where we'll get to first. But first, I want you to kind of get together and kind of release what thoughts are going through your mind. Okay, and then I'll help you guys. All right, go for it.
He doesn't take that away.
What do you think?
I was like, what?
Yeah, like you have to know that's in my heart.
Yeah, I was just Francis like
I helped him out so much.
no, that's it. Like we don't want to.
I'm okay. You see what I'm saying?
That's it.
And so I'm like, yeah, I'm telling you, yeah, I was right. But at the same time, my heart's not completely probably doesn't help him out if he is. But in my heart,
Wait, so what does that have to do with it?
So does this mean that he was determined, so he was taking his spot, or it was determined for him to influence, or?
no, what I'm saying is, okay, in my heart, I said, but then at the same time, I had a and so that's the contrary, where I might say something, but you know, I'm not completely at ease. But yet, God showed me the following day that far more than following his. And I'm like, whoa. They got and he did it. He did have
Okay, so you're saying he got this, and then he started having a clock call, therefore it's determined for him.
No, I'm not saying that. But that's not where I was going. What I'm saying is,
And honestly, in hindsight,
what I'm trying to focus on is not the sex story. But what I say is
Maybe, I mean, it's always amazing.
and it's not saying that, you know, I'm questioning and that's what I'm saying. It's not like not fully. It's only like maybe 90%.
do it again?
What that is.
So what does that have to do with determinism?
Well, I forgot the last one. Okay, what was the question?
Based on what Terry telling us, you're telling us that his coworker made so much money.
Yeah.
And then from there, he didn't have any car problems, therefore it's
not that he was car from
No, he was gonna have car problems.
Yeah.
So therefore, was it predetermined that he was gonna get some money to fix his car? Is that what you're trying to get at?
No, I mean, I was trying to.
Yeah. This is what I drew from.
It wasn't so much that. I was really focused on we might see something that we
So that I can be regardless of that. It was still my responsibility to care.
Now, so as far as the subject, that's what I gathered.
Yeah, I should have focused more. I'm a horrible explainer.
As soon as you said he made money, and then his car broke down, I'm like, that's where he's going with this. So it was predetermined for him to make X amount of money because his car was gonna break.
No.
It's consequential.
Yeah.
Maybe it broke down because he didn't change the oil in the last 6 months.
It's like when somebody hits.
It happens.
Because it is easy to control.
All right, let's come back together. Let me show you guys some other examples. Again, you guys are like, no, for sure, I have free will. So this is a good example of one. This is the illusion of free will. Okay, so maybe it's, again, obviously we're not saying it's like this, but what if it's like that, right? Again, it seems like you're making choices, but in the end, it all just goes down to, you have only one exit. So no matter what decision you make, in the end, you're going to do what God wants you to do. Okay, this is what we call soft determinism, but basically it's determinism in the end. Okay, I'll give you some other examples. Another really famous pastor, he's like a really big, he's very strong determinist. His name is John Piper, great pastor. God not only understands, this is when he's talking about coronavirus. Okay, God not only understands the coronavirus, he has purposed it. He has purpose for it. God does nothing and permits nothing without wise purposes. Nothing just happens. So do you guys see more examples of this? Okay. Daniel's favorite, Francis Chan, here we go. Joseph, when he's talking about Joseph, remember all the negative things that happened to Joseph? Okay. Joseph looked at things differently because he knew who was ultimately in control. Okay. Again, God, right? This isn't about you. If anyone's guilty, it will be the Father. The Father decided this. The Father wanted this. This was part of the Father's plan. I don't know why bad things happen to me, but again, it's all in God's bigger plan. You think things happen by accident? It's part of God's bigger plan. So if somebody cuts me off, shrug. God is trying to teach me something. Someone's driving 20 miles per hour, God's trying to teach me patience. It's not them who's doing it to you. God has a bigger plan. Okay. So again, this is determinism. Okay, so again, I want you guys to know these are Bible-believing pastors who also believe that God is a loving God, and yet they still believe this stuff. Okay? So again, most of you guys are going to say, well, no, God isn't love if he does this. But that's not a biblical reason. Okay, that's a philosophical reason. Just because you can't imagine God being loving, that doesn't mean that God can't be loving, also determining our lives. Just like, for example, when my baby was born, there was a whole bunch of different shots he had to take, right? Because of vaccines and different things, right? So for the baby looking at me, even now actually, if I take him to the doctor and I have to hold him down when they give him a shot, what are they thinking? What does the baby think about me? How can my dad be a loving person when he's holding me down and somebody's poking needles in my arm? How can my dad be a loving God? But just because you don't understand something, that doesn't mean that God cannot be loving. So that in itself cannot defeat determinism. Does that make sense? So just because you don't understand something, or just because it seems like God is guilty or this kind of thing, that doesn't mean that God can't be a loving God. Okay? So the real reason for me why I believe that the Bible teaches not determinism, but free will, is because I think there's a biblical reason behind it. Does that make sense? Okay? And the argument that I'm going to make is that God does not always get what he wants. Okay? So we see in the Bible that God does not always get what he wants. Now, this is problematic for a lot of people because you go, oh, but God is all powerful. Right? God is all powerful. How is it possible that he does not always get what you want? Does that make sense? So that's the argument that determinists make. They say, no, it says in the Bible God is all powerful. So how is it possible that I could say these kind of things? Okay? The only other logical possibility is that God is all powerful, yet he limits his own power. Does that make sense? So it's not that God is not all powerful. It's just that within his all powerfulness, he decides to lower his power because he gave us free will. Does that make sense? And I'm going to give you examples of that. I'm not just giving you philosophy, but I'm going to actually give you guys Bible verses to show this, okay? I want you guys to, in your partners, we have 4 different, let's do, for you guys, this group, you guys do number 1. And Danny and this group here do number 2. And then over here, you guys do 3 and 4. Okay? So get together, and these verses will kind of show you how is it that God does not always get what he wants. Okay? So let's take some time to do that. Actually, group 2, let's do 2 and 3, because your verse is pretty short. And then you guys do 4.
4?
Yeah, you guys do 4. Sorry.
Like I said, I've read this before, but like in the perspective that we're looking at, it's like
I've read this one. It's like verse 5. That's the one that touches you by the
in a nutshell, he goes back home and he's teaching the synagogue that he's going to brothers and sisters and his family. And like, isn't he a carpenter? Like, he's not a teacher by any means.
Well, at least he wasn't like what you were. Like he grew up in that. Like he was not a Pharisee.
Yeah, exactly. He isn't like a religious person.
Or studied scripture.
That's why we're like 15 years. What's he doing up there?
I have heard of that even about like even prophets or whatnot. Not even like experts. I've read. But I've heard where he was born in Apple. And he really said it.
On it says, no mighty work this. I think there was times when I think 6 people did it. So he did kill some people, but maybe it wasn't to the extent to
He wanted to.
we got how to try to that.
Because they're very desperate.
Yeah.
Because he always said,
And if you in number 6, it says he marveled because of their unbelief. So he was like, wow, I did all this stuff and you guys are not gonna believe or, trust what I'm saying. And he just did that. He goes on, he just did it.
This is what the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel,
This is the first time.
All I said is, we're reading it under the lens of the mindset of like, we're looking at everything of God in this way.
Returning to me and resting on me.
and then in verse 8 she says, so the Lord must wait for you to come to him, so he can show you his love.
All right, let's come back together. Group one, can you guys kind of tell us what's going on and then how we see that God does not always get what he wants?
So he comes back to his hometown.
Who's he?
Jesus.
Okay.
Okay. Jesus comes back to his own country and his disciples come with him. Sabbath comes around. He goes to the church or the synagogue, starts preaching, talking, and he starts healing a few people. And like the Pharisees are like, hey, this is not the carpenter's son of Mary and brother James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and are not his sisters with him? And they were offended at him. And when we go on to verse 5, he says he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, just a few of them. And then on 6, it says he marveled because of their unbelief. So even though he was performing miracles, they were like, no, we don't want this. And then from there he ends up leaving and he goes to the next villages teaching.
So how does that show us God does not always get what he wants?
Because they didn't accept them. He went by trying to see about sharing God's love, or Jesus went by to preach and minister to them, but they didn't want to be preached and ministered to by Jesus because they were like, this is not who we are expecting.
Right.
You're not a prophet.
So we could kind of see from the text itself that he was not able to heal many because of their unbelief. So it seems like he wants to heal, right? But he can't because of their unbelief. So there's things that we see that Jesus is limited by. Okay? Can you give us?
In the first one, number 2, Jesus is crying over Jerusalem because he says that he wanted to, gather Jerusalem to himself.
Okay, so that's a will, right? I want to.
He wanted to, but they wouldn't let him.
Okay. Again, that's another example of he says, I want to. I have a will, but it's not happening. Okay? And then number 3.
In 15, it talks about God speaking to Israel, and he's saying, hey, you should repent. It says, in repentance and trust you will be saved, in quietness and trust is your strength. So he's saying, come to him, but he says you are not willing. And at the end of verse 18, it says, therefore the Lord longs to be gracious to you, and I guess the key verse is, and therefore he waits on high to have compassion. So he's waiting on his people to make a decision.
So come back, but he's not getting what he wants. He's like, I have to wait for you guys. Okay, so again, if God just determines everything, why is he also saying, I want this, but I'm not having this? Okay, and then Lee or Julie.
Okay, so in Deuteronomy 30:15, God is saying, I'm setting before you life, life and good, death and evil. So basically, he's giving us the choice to choose to follow his commandments. He wants us to obey him out of love, to follow his commandments, and we'll receive blessings. But if we turn our hearts to do evil, to serve other gods, and to turn away from his ordinances, his commandments, then we choose death. And so he doesn't get what he wants because he wants all the people that he created, he wants them all to love him and to choose life.
Right.
But that doesn't happen.
Right. Okay. So again, very important. We're not lowering God's power by any means. God is all sovereign. God is all powerful. He could do whatever he wants. But with that choice, with all the power he has, he chooses to lower himself. And this is what we call self-limitation or divine limitation. he has limited himself because he wanted to interact with us. Does that make sense? So when he interacts with us, because he has given us free will, there are certain things that he cannot do. Because he has chosen from the beginning that he chose to limit his freedom by giving us free will. So God is still all-powerful. So it's very important. Okay. Any questions or clarifications?
So how is that not evident to these other pastors who were determinists? Like, it's very clear, I mean, the word choose is used.
Right. Right. But the word choose for them is like this.
Okay.
Word choose, yeah.
So whatever you choose, it's gonna end up.
In the end, it's going to
whatever
do what God wants
is-
us to do. Yeah.
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 Predestined.
Right.
That's not the way it is.
But is there a difference between that and God knows what you're going to choose?
Yes. There's a difference. Okay, so I'll go back to that, okay? Okay, so try to bear with me, okay? I know I might lose some of you guys. So this is what we call prescriptive knowledge and descriptive knowledge, okay? Prescriptive knowledge is basically what you guys are all thinking, okay? Which is God knows beforehand because God chose certain people, or he determined everything. So that's why he knows everything. For example, but obviously there are certain things in the Bible that he prescribes. Like we know in the end that God's gonna come, second coming, and destroy the whole world, and
That's very determined.
like that's very right. Okay, there are certain things that God can do because that's again his prerogative without infringing on our free will. Does that make sense? Like I can steal. I can't. Let me actually do this first. There's a difference between free will and free choices. But a lot of us think like free will means like unlimited amount of choices, and that's different. So, for example, I'll give you an example of this. Okay, so there's a serial killer. Okay, and he wants to kill a lot of people. So we arrest him and put him in like a straitjacket so he cannot move and put him in jail. What did we do? Do we limit his free will or free choices?
Free choices.
But he still has the what?
Free will.
The will to kill. So God can eliminate your choices if he wants to because he's powerful. That doesn't mean that he can change your will. For example, Jonah. Did God eliminate some choices of him running away? Absolutely. Okay? He wanted to run away. He didn't want to go. Do you remember? He didn't want to go. And he went the other way. He went to, was it somewhere else? Tarsus, right? Yeah, he ran away. But God sent him a storm and then, but did it change his will? No. In the end, Jonah made a choice. Does that make sense? So there's a difference between, so God can do things because he also has free will, he also has power. But that doesn't mean that he can change our will. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, there's a lot of things that God knows ahead of time because God, he knows what, he already made decisions that he already knows ahead of time. Okay? But there's also descriptive as well, which is he didn't necessarily make choices, but he just knows things ahead of time. Okay? But I know this is really difficult, okay? The reason why this is really difficult is because, ignore all of this stuff, okay? It's just complicated stuff. But the basic idea is we look at time linearly. Right? So there's a past, present, future. So we see it like this. But what if, and this is not for real, this is not what the Bible says. I'm just giving you a philosophical thought, if it's possibility, okay? So what if God looks at time like this? So for example, what if God is in the center, so he sees 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock at the same time? Does that make sense? So again, if we don't think of time linearly, then it's possible that, again, I'm not saying God does this, but I'm just giving you a conception of where God can know the future and yet not determine what we do. He just knows things ahead of time because he looks at time differently than we do.
So they say like a day with God is as 1,000.
Sure, exactly. Right. There's Bible verses that says, for God, 1 day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is 1 day to him. Again, how do we understand that? We don't understand that because our time doesn't work like that. But for God, if his time looked like this, perhaps, then that could make sense. Right? 1,000 years, one day, it's the same thing for him because he sees time differently than we do.
He can always see the big picture from the beginning to the end. We can only see what we were related to in our past, present, future, what we learned from other sources. But
Right.
we can't see, from the beginning of the time, before creation and all through that, we can't literally see and understand everything.
So if we go back to example of Jonah, okay, again, determinists would say, no, that's prescriptive. God chose him. And that's why he knows ahead of time. But we could just say, no, that's descriptive. Okay? Jesus just foreknew what Jonah, what's his name? Judas was going to do. So if Judas would not have betrayed Jesus, then Jesus would have known a different future. He would have said something different. Okay?
Well, like all the prophets could see the future, but they didn't determine the future.
Right,
Isn't this-
right. But that's a little bit different because they were given that by God. Right. Whereas right now we're talking more about God's knowledge. Yeah. Whereas like given knowledge is a little bit different. Because nobody gives knowledge to God. Right. Did that answer your question, Daniel?
Yeah.
Okay. So there is a different concept of like, so again, just because you foreknow something, that doesn't mean that you determined it to happen. Yeah, there is a different. I mean, you could see it that way, but there's another way to look at foreknowledge as well.
Yeah.
And of course, there are certain things that God already knows, like predestined. Like God predestined us to be His child. As in, like He already had all this plan in mind, like Jesus coming and dying for us, and because of that, we're going to become His son. So Him pre-knowing that or pre-even planning that, that's not a problem. That doesn't eliminate our free will. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I encourage you guys not to use these phrases. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of phrases, but I encourage you. I'm just saying this, okay? Because a lot of people, I mean, you might not necessarily say these things with determinism in mind, but most people hear it that way. And so I encourage you. So if you ever talk to me, I never use these kind of phrases for a reason, because it's very confusing for people. Okay, especially for non-Christians. When non-Christians hear this kind of stuff, they're thinking, "Oh yeah, God controls everything." Mm-hmm. Okay, so everything happens for a reason. God opens and closes doors. Does He do that? Absolutely. We see it in the Bible. Okay, but again, what most people think is God closes and opens every single door. So every single thing that happened in your life, like if you you apply for 2 jobs and you got 1 job, then God's will. Okay, is that possible? Absolutely possible. But to say that every single one of those things are like that, that's very presumptuous and not biblical either. Okay, there are no accidents. God gives and takes away. Are there things that God gives? Again, that's why. Again, these can be true statements. Okay, but again, most people they take it with determinism. Trust God and know that God knows the best for you. Is this true? Absolutely true. But again, a lot of people take it deterministically. God's in control. Is God in control? Absolutely, He's in control. But again, you have to be careful, because what they mean by God is in control is God is in control of everything that we do. Okay, so for me, I don't use these kind of phrases. Okay, this was an Adventist pastor. I think he sums it up very, very well. Everything that God does is an act of God. Love, sorry. But not everything that happens is an act of God. Does that make sense? Everything God does is an act of love, but not everything that happens is an act of God. Okay?
I keep going back to this concept of like a virus, like with that pastor saying COVID was like predetermined by God.
Sure.
Like that's the ultimate example of free will, because it's like you can combine a lot of different viruses and it's like this Cambrian explosion happens and there's a new virus.
Okay.
And then like an evil person of free will or choice releases that virus into the world.
Definitely
Like the
possibility.
combination of viruses, like then we create vaccines and then a new virus. It's like animals evolve over time based on climate. It's like these are all things that it's like God created all this, but then he also created this like ultimate openness of free will. And
Sure.
like this like creationism that happens. Like he's not, I don't know.
Sure.
My argument would be like he's not over there orchestrating the creation of new viruses.
Sure.
And then be like, oh yeah, but here humans, you go create a new vaccine. Because then that would
Right.
all be predetermined. It's like what? It's like if you just view that virus as free will
Yeah.
and the creation of new viruses over time.
Right.
you-
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's how we would view it. The people on the free will side, but again, on the determinist side, they would just say no. God actually controls even human beings to do these things,
And the viruses.
and the every
microorganisms.
every single thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything is purposed by God. Okay, but again, we have to give a biblical reasoning
But
why
then they
we
argue
don't
that he controls evil as well.
everything, every single thing,
Interesting.
so that God could be glorified at the end. So it's almost like God purposely gave us these negative things so that like we know that God is a good God. Yeah. Again, if you think philosophically, it just makes no sense. So that's why these determinants, they don't even go there. They go, yeah, if you just think about it in our, again, human mind, it's not going to make sense. But if God says this is what it is, then it is what it is. Yeah. Okay. Before, do we have? Okay, we don't have. Okay. By the way, if you want to go a little bit more in depth, okay, if you go to Romans chapter 8 and Romans chapter 9, it's going to destroy you, and you're going to believe in determinism again. Okay. So let me just tell you. Okay. Go to Romans chapter 8. And Romans chapter 9, and everything that I have talked about, you'll say, no, determinism is absolutely true. Okay, if you, obviously, I have like rebuttal to all of that, but it's pretty strong. Specifically, Romans.
You're saying your rebuttal is weak compared to 8?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But just a superficial reading of it,
Oh.
it sounds very deterministic. Yeah, don't read it right now. Yeah. Okay? Don't read it right now.
Find Jeffrey Church, man.
Yeah.
What was that guy's name? Dan.
Okay. Do you guys want to do another one real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do another. This one, I'm going to do it really fast. Okay? Because this one is just like, you just need to read the Bible and it's that easy. But people don't like to read the Bible and they just like to believe in things. Okay? Okay, the next one is this one. Okay, God won't give you more than you can handle. Okay, God won't give you more than you can handle. Okay, really quickly, 2 minutes, really quickly, do you think this is biblical?
No.
Okay? Okay, go for it.
Usually that goes, it's tied to
I think so.
Dios le da la batalla. It does say in the Bible
more than
I heard that so
Right.
many
So
times.
that's the first and second part of that. Yeah.
Oh man.
But here, I think this is used more for when you're going through some crazy will.
I think I remember.
Or will.
I've heard this statement before.
He will give you so much that you can't.
I feel like if God,
God will give you more.
Or you say, we will not.
he would handle it. Like, should you challenge it? Like, well, in the sense that,
It'll challenge you, but to a certain point, and then that's what it's gonna be like. No, that's enough challenge. You've learned, and then it's gonna step away.
So why not?
That's usually the way to think about it.
They can never
Will you
say,
have free will?
You know what I mean? You won't need God. You know, because
I got it. I got it.
When somebody's going through struggles,
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm gonna do, and they're like,
Oh,
oh,
don't
you
worry, there's individuals
just
who
can't
had
handle
at
it.
that time that kept the
I've used that so many
Elijah.
There's a lot of things, yeah, I'm like, oh my God.
Okay, let's come back together. When I was a hospital chaplain for a couple of months during the summer, I met a patient in there, and he was suffering a lot. And he said this. He said, "Chaplain, I know that God doesn't give me more than I can handle, but I don't understand. I can't handle this. This is too much pain." Okay? So again, this idea, and most people use this when it's suffering. Right? God won't let you suffer more than you can't handle. Okay? So do you guys think this is biblical?
No.
Is there a Bible verse that says something like this?
Yeah, there
think
is,
so, yeah.
but I don't
Okay, there is. However, it's misquoted. So it's half true. This concept or this phraseology is in the Bible, but they misuse a word. There's nothing, this verse has nothing to do with suffering. Okay, let's read it together. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Everybody there?
Yeah.
Okay, I know everybody has different versions, so I'm just going to read it. It's not going to be the exact same thing, okay? I'm going to read from verse 11. Now these things happened to them as examples, and they were written as a warning to us. So on whom the end of the age have come. So whoever thinks he can stand must be careful not to fall. Okay? No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to humanity. God is faithful, and what does it say? He will not allow you to be tempted. Not suffering, not challenges, temptation. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape so you are not able to bear it. So the church of, to give you a background, Church of Corinthians, they live in like basically Las Vegas on the strip. That was kind of like the environment they were living in. And so a lot of these Corinthians, they were, even though they became Christian, they kept going back into sin. And so they were like, well, you know, like this is just too much. This is too much. And Paul's basically saying, no, don't you understand? It's not just you guys. Every single human have gone through temptation at some certain point. It's not just you guys. And that's why he says, if you look at verse 13, no temptation has taken except what is common to humanity. Okay, so he's basically trying to say you're in no different situation. Okay, when it comes to temptation. So what I'm trying to say is this verse is very good when if you're talking about temptation, because some of you guys feel like this temptation is too much, and so for you guys this verse is perfect because it's basically saying no, God is not going to allow that. Okay, and He will give you a way out. There's always a way out, but most of us use this verse to talk about situations when it's talking about suffering. Like God won't give you more pain than that is like you can handle. But that's not what the verse is talking about at all. It's talking about temptation. Like sin, yeah. Yeah. Because in James chapter 1, it talks about how God does not tempt you, it's Satan who's tempting you. And God's saying, no, He's tempting you, but I'm not going to allow Him to tempt you so much so that you have no free will to overcome it. I will always give you power, protection, and a way for you to get out of it. That's what he's saying here. So if you actually read the whole context, we only read this part. If you actually read the whole context, you could kind of see, oh yeah, he's talking about temptation, not about like suffering, like pain. Does that make sense? Again, I know we went over this very quickly because it's just because we have to finish. Any questions, clarifications?
Does it all tie back to good versus evil, Hunter?
What do you mean?
Meaning that like things can happen to you for no reason because evil's will was enforcing upon you.
Sure, that is definitely a
God
possibility.
wasn't like determining that. He let
Sure.
evil on earth.
Sure.
So someone could walk in the street and shoot us all. There
Absolutely.
wouldn't be a reason for it other than like the reason would be evil and
Right.
choices and will that evil individual made.
Exactly.
So for us, there would be no reason.
That's what we would say.
Yeah.
We as in the
But then
free
the other
will.
pastor would say no.
No. Yeah. Exactly. Dan, did you have something?
I mean, this could be a topic for later, but you know, like in like Moses and like Pharaoh,
Yeah.
it's God. What do you say? He like
Harden Pharaoh's heart. Okay, good. Okay, I'll get that.
You're like, well,
Okay, so we're going back to the determinism thing, which is good. So that's another great example of what determinists use to say, oh, you see, God can change people's heart if he wants to. And actually, in Romans chapter 9, Paul actually talks about that. So let me give a rebuttal to that really quickly. Let me open up the slide. Did you guys understand what he's saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll give you the verse just to show you guys. Then the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. Blah, 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 blah. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Okay, and though I multiply my signs and wonders, he will not listen to you. Well, how is he going to listen if you're the one who again? So God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Okay, so this one is just a language thing. Okay, this is actually not too difficult. So, for example, this is pretty simple if you think of it like this. Okay, so depending on the substance of the subject itself, okay, it can determine what kind of cause it's going to make. Okay, for example, the sun. If the sun shines on ice, what happens to the ice? It melts. Okay, so we would say the sun caused ice to melt. But if it goes to clay, what happens? It hardens. So what do we say? Sun harden the clay. So when God says, I will harden Pharaoh, he's just talking about how I will act upon it and then he will harden because he has a heart of clay.
So he's just saying because of the way Pharaoh is,
Exactly.
I can't help but harden his heart.
Right,
because-
exactly. I will act and he will behave this way. Yeah, so it's just a
Oh,
language
that he
thing.
wasn't controlling the Pharaoh.
No.
It was a reaction.
Exactly, it's a reaction. He's talking about the reaction. This is going to be ironic, but if the Pharaoh had a heart of ice, but ironic, but then it would have melted instead. Yeah.
I mean, most of us did.
Me too.
So basically, to me, the Pharaoh had no compassion to begin with.
Exactly. If his condition was different, then he would have responded differently. Yeah. Same thing with. So another example is remember when Jesus threw out seeds. He talks about that. Jesus didn't do it. He has a parable, and then he's like he throws out seed here, and then some of the ground. What happened? It was rocky, so it didn't grow. Some of it was fertile, so it grew. It wasn't the seed problem, right? It was the ground problem. Same thing. So if the Pharaoh's heart was good, then God's words would have transformed him. But because his heart was rocky, it didn't do anything. It actually made it worse. Yeah. So that's how we understand it.
And that's another argument against determinism. Because he couldn't control the Pharaoh.
Right.
He couldn't
That's
bend
what
the Pharaoh's will.
right. That's what we would say, but then they would see it as no. We clearly see God controlling Pharaoh's heart as well. Yeah. So again, depending on what kind of glasses you put on, you could see it differently. Yeah. But I think for me, the strongest argument is we see God himself saying, I want this, but it's not happening because of you guys. So I think that's a pretty clear indicator of God does not always get what he wants.
The whole story of the Old Testament, is that right?
That's what I would say.
And he says, finally, it's just like,
Yeah. But what they would say is that's just how God scripted it. Yeah. We could go into a lot more. I could give you guys like 10 slide, like 10 series lecture on it. Yeah. But this is very important because it really changes. I'm very passionate about this because it really changes our view of God. And especially because when we go through difficult times, like our view of God really gets messed up. Well, like God wanted this to happen to me. Why? I don't understand. I can't handle this, but why does God allow this to happen? This kind of stuff. Or everything happens for a reason, but I don't see the reason, so therefore God must be a horrible God. Yeah, these things happen. Yeah, question.
So regarding that, wasn't also some Egyptians didn't